Hello and welcome. So something I think that's weird about modern people that I wanted to reflect on is that we are simultaneously really triumphalist about the achievements of the modern world. We have material prosperity, we have a modern medicine, look at all our technology, etc. But we're also at the same time just really cynical and gloomy and frustrated about the actual quality of life in the modern nation state. So people are very transparent about government corruption. We're just like, oh yeah, government's corrupt. Oh yeah, there's all these corporate abuses. We have not just material poverty, but cultural poverty. People complain about this. There's all these atrocities and horrors and all these things that are part of the modern world. And modern people, for as much as we're ready to complain about all these things, we're also really quick to defend this whole idea of modernity. We're like, oh yeah, it's great. We have this whole narrative. But then we turn around and immediately talk about everything that's wrong with it, you know? So I had Zoomer age undergraduates when I was a professor, and they said that they were doomers. That's what they called themselves, not Zoomers, but doomers, because they was like, yeah, the whole world's ending. Are we even going to have a planet by the time we graduate? Somebody said this to me. So it's weird. We're constantly of two minds about these issues. Like we're trying to believe in this particular dream, but it isn't coming true. It almost reminds me of the person who eats junk food or smokes cigarettes or something, but then at the same time jokes about how unhealthy it is for him, and it's like, oh, it's gonna kill me. Something's gonna kill you anyway. You know, it's like they acknowledge the problem and still do it. This kind of reminds me of our culture. It's like we know the dream is dead, but we're not yet ready to give up on it. So, what is the dream? What are we doing? I want to talk a little bit about so we're going to take the Enlightenment dream from last week, and we're going to run it all the way through to the 20th century. So there's three kind of elements that I think are important in understanding the Enlightenment dream as it frames our situation today. So first is the myth of progress. This is what historians call it, actually. So there was this idea, we talked a lot about mythic framework last week, that the past was bad. There was the Dark Ages and the oppressive church and all this horrible stuff. And then because of the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the rebirth, everything's gotten better and everything's going to keep getting better. And so the major part of our mythology that we think is going to fix all this is technology, which is an outgrowth of the advance of reason, the advance of science. And with all of these things, which we didn't have access to in the horrible, horrible Dark Ages, we are going to build utopia. We're going to fix the world. We're going to fix mankind. And part of this myth of progress, obviously, is to reframe the past into thinking about the past in terms of a progression of history, which, again, ancient people, by and large, didn't think of history in this progressive way at all. They tended to think that history was circular. That's another story. But a big one is this framing that we don't need religion. That's a huge premise for secularism. We can be moral without religion. We can run the government without religion. We can have individual lives that are fulfilling without religion. If you want it, that's an option for you, because we're not going to shut anything down, because freedom. But you don't need it. It's not necessary. And that's part of this myth of progress thing. Now, spoiler, none of this really goes where the Enlightenment thinkers want it to. And that's why historians call it the myth of progress, because it, not only that it sort of didn't happen the way that they didn't, the way that they envisioned it happening, but because it's fundamentally a mythical way of thinking, like we've been talking about. It's part of the imaginative framework when you read history in a certain way. Okay, so what's the second attribute of this Enlightenment thinking that gets carried through into modernity and defines modernity? It's this idea of a rationalist ethics. So what that means is, it's like, okay, we don't need religion. We don't need the church. Okay, well, what are you going to base your morality on? Well, we're going to base it on reason. It's going to be a rationalist ethics. We can use reason to determine what's good and bad and what we should do. And so one major way that these modern people try to reframe morality was in terms of a philosophy called utilitarianism. So this was an idea that you should look at the world in terms of utility value. So what's the outcome? So we don't want to talk about religion or cosmic good or absolute moral statements about the universe. We don't need to do all that. All we need to do is look at what the outcome is. Is it good or bad? And then we'll just be practical. We'll solve it like any other engineering problem, and that's how we'll make the world a better place. So the major outcome that they looked at was pain and pleasure. So obviously, you want to maximize the most pleasure for the most people and minimize pain for the most people. So that's called the utilitarian calculus. So the utilitarian thinkers, we'll talk about this when we do modern philosophy later, they thought in terms of an actual calculus. Dolars and hedons were, a hedon was 1 unit of pleasure and a dolar was 1 unit of pain. And so if you have a situation, you add up all the possible hedons and then all the possible dolars and you assign values to them. And then if the net result is positive, you're trying to make that net result better. Then it's a good thing. Then that's what we should base our morality on. And I'm not kidding. They really did do this arithmetic and in order to make it a mathematical engineering problem, because they all thought that math and human reason would be the thing that they could define morality through. And I'm poking over to chat here. Who gets to define what counts as pleasure and what counts as pain? Yes, of course. Of course. That is, of course, the question. And also, isn't some pain good? Right? I mean, I get sore after I lift weights. I'm in pain when I have to stay up late with my toddler when she's sick, so obviously morality can't be reducible to pain and pleasure. It's not that unidimensional, but of course, then even if it is, who gets to define it? And by and large, the answer is that the individual gets to define it. What I feel, I'm the only one who knows what I'm experiencing. So I get to feel these things. I get to decide what's good and bad. And of course, that's part of the problem because a rationalist ethics like this only goes to individualism and freedom. So we talked about this several episodes back where modernity really redefined freedom away from an ancient and medieval perspective towards this idea that freedom is the unconstrained expression of your will. If you want something and you get to do it, then you're more free. So morality replaced by utilitarianism, individualism, freedom redefined in terms of individualism. And then, of course, all of this is conceived of as neutral. We don't need religion. Any rational person gets to not only to define these things, but recognize them. If you're just smart and you use reason and you're educated properly, you can arrive at a rationalist ethics without recourse to religion. And that sounds great if you think of religion as some particular institutional body. But of course, when we talk about religion, we're talking about worldview. We're talking about moral statements about absolute reality. And so essentially, this movement is towards not thinking of morality in terms of absolute statements about reality, which means by definition, we're not really talking about morality anymore. At best, we're talking about individual wants, which is not the same thing. We will get into this more later. Okay. So, what is this thing? I have Chris here. And pleasure for the individual, regardless, even at the cost of increased pain for others. Yeah. So it's an impossible math, as you put it. I mean, how do you calculate this? But you see, you're like, Chad is raising all these problems with this, which I'm very appreciative, but you have to therefore appreciate the supreme triumphalist arrogance of these Enlightenment thinkers, because they really did think that if you could just reduce everything to mathematical formulae or logical constructions or the correct model for the universe, that man, the Lord and possessor of nature, could actually master all things. Why else would Laplace think that conceive of a demon who, if it knew every single data point about the universe, could predict everything, right? It's really a quest for omniscience. Isn't that crazy? Like, well, who says, and how do we do this math possibly? They thought they could do this math possibly. Isn't that crazy? Like the profound, I'm not being condescending when I say the profound arrogance of these thinkers, that they really thought that man was the center of creation and that he could transcend all things with his mind. That's so Enlightenment thinker. Okay, So myth of progress, the rationalist ethics that you can and should do with reason alone and math or whatever. And then the third thing is the secular nation state. And obviously, if you reconceive of things like morality and society in purely rationalist terms, so you think, then the state is going to be run that way too. And so this is where the creation of the secular nation state occurs, meaning a nation state that is totally free of all religious influences. And you could say something American like the separation of church and state, but really what we're talking about is the idea that the state has no moral authority higher than itself. We're going to come back to that later, but I want you to have that in your mind as we go forward. So just like morality, we can figure out what's right and wrong without religion. Secular nation state is we can run the state without religion. We don't need it. It's not necessary. And actually, side note, this is a very Protestant way of thinking about things. It's Protestant in the sense that Protestantism is often characterized, if I was going to generalize broadly, Protestantism is often characterized by an emphasis on what's necessary. You know, what do I have to do to be saved? This sort of necessity-based thinking. And then everything else that's extraneous is allowed to be a matter of personal opinion, but we have to define what's the minimum. And then if you do the minimum, you're good. Obviously, this is not an orthodox way of thinking. It's kind of a legalist, rationalist way of thinking. That's why we talked about scholasticism into the Reformation, into the Enlightenment, and now we're here. We're seeing the fruits of that played out at the societal level. Okay, so you may ask yourself, big promises, big if true, as they say on the internet, about all these promises of the Enlightenment. Did it play out the way that they thought? What actually happened? So I'm going to run very quickly through some of the periods of history following this. Obviously, each one of these could be its own show. I hope to do a series on a lot of these as we go forward. But in brief, because I want you to know the historical trajectory of this, what happens almost immediately in the face of the Enlightenment is what's called Romanticism, which is a period of history. Usually it's characterized by art, poetry, paintings, etc., music. If you know classical music, you know there's a progression from classical music, from the classical era of classical music to the Romantic era of classical music. And the Romantic era, what is the deal with this? Well, it's called Romantic because it's kind of has this nostalgia. It's a complicated movement, but basically, if I had to summarize it, it will be the opposite of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is all about reason, math, calculation. We're going to order the universe. And then the Reformation is this pushback, and it's all about feelings and subjectivity and emotions and pain and art and all the things, in other words, that the Enlightenment abandoned and said was not valid for a way to structure society or to know the truth. So obviously, the proof in the pudding here is you can't have a totally rationalist universe, because it's not that. I'm not saying you can't have a smart universe. People hear me say anti-rationalist things and they think like, oh, you're against thinking and intelligence. No, thinking good. But the specific type of Enlightenment rationalism is a mechanistic one. That's what we talked about last week. It's the attempt to do reductionism, to reduce everything in the human experience to a predictable mechanism. That's the kind of rationalism that we're talking about, the kind of rationalism that says religious experience, aesthetic experience, love, emotions, those things are merely subjective and therefore not really part of the absolute truth of reality. Well, the Romantic movement is this big pushback against all of that. So immediately there's all this pushback because that's not sustainable. So there's kind of this dialectic between the rationalist Enlightenment thinking and the Romantic response to that. And there's a couple other features of Romanticism that are interesting. There's a constant rise in interest in the occult, in spirits, and mediums. That's going to be a whole podcast when we get to it. There's an interest in the macabre, in death. Edgar Allan Poe is a great example of a Romantic poet, I think. So, and you see it in music too, all the classical music stuff. The subject matter changes in classical music. The subject matter changes in art history. Look for it. It's definitely there. I'm looking at comments here. Yes. I never realized the musical connection. Classical and Baroque have very strict mechanistic rules. Yes, absolutely true. I love Baroque music. Some people call it like math music. It's very cool. Mechanistic rules. Romantic feels more free, leads into atonality in the 20th century. Yeah. So it's in, if you look at any art history movement, you will see this progression from Enlightenment to Romantic in that period. And a lot of our great art comes from there. I love a lot of this stuff, by the way. I love Poe. I love classical music, both classical, Baroque, and Romantic. But you see it's there. It's part of our heritage. Okay, so then what happens after that? I'm skipping a little bit. Obviously, these are large periods of history. But something that comes up that's really important in the 18th and 19th centuries is evolution and eugenics. So when Darwin comes out, and I want to obviously do a whole thing on Darwin and evolution, the question about whether or not things evolved or how old the earth is and all that, I want to bracket that question. I'm not interested in the facts or of evolution or whatever right now. What's important for our discussion is the cultural impact of Darwinism, which was another nail in the coffin of the old Christendom, because it was not done neutrally. It was immediately appropriated by this Enlightenment motion in history to say, aha, and Genesis is wrong too, because now we know that everything evolved. There's no need for God. We can explain everything without God. That was so much of the rhetoric surrounding this, right? Regardless of what you think of evolution or the age of the earth, that's not relevant to this discussion. What I'm pointing to is the way in which these Darwinist ideas were immediately weaponized into anti-religious, pro-secular, not just statements about the world, but actually building into it the worldview, the blindness of nature. Again, reducing nature to this mechanistic process. And then how that immediately led to social Darwinism, which is the idea that mankind now, we need to take this approach to man where we need to start thinking about eugenics. Some people should reproduce and others shouldn't. We need survival of the fittest. If we're going to become the lords and possessors of nature, we need to take over and dominate the evolutionary progression of man himself. So this leads to all these identifications of race theory and which races are inferior and which races are superior. All of that, which a lot of people don't like, comes out of the appropriation of Darwinism, which a lot of people do like. So that's something to put in your pipe and smoke. And I think it's no wonder that at this point in history, there's also the age of exploration, the expansions of the nation states all across the world, encountering all these indigenous civilizations and doing what? Enslaving them. Why? Because they're obviously inferior races. This is the part where somebody clips me. But from the perspective of these Enlightenment thinkers, right? There's no supreme, universal, radical human dignity because everyone's in the image of Christ. There's just people on a spectrum of more progressive and less. So you encounter these primitive races, they don't even have metal or writing. Well, obviously they're inferior. And obviously, you know, it's like you see the eugenics connection here. And there's a rise of eugenics in the 19th and 20th centuries that is I think, part and parcel with the push towards, well, the push from the Enlightenment dreams about mechanism, about becoming the lords and possessors of nature, and about guiding our own evolution. Okay, so what's happening? The nation states are expanding all over the world. They're carving up the rest of the world because all this technology and science and whatever has led to all these expansions. They go around the planet. They discover the new world. They're carving up everything. The establishment of America is in some sense the most Enlightenment country of all time because it was this new project. All these Enlightenment thinkers were like, oh, good, we can start a new nation. Now we can try the Enlightenment dream. And that's another topic that I'm very excited to get into. And so fast forwarding a little bit to the 20th century, the 20th century has gotten a lot of ink spilled about it because it is such a unprecedented century in human history. And I want to just run through a little bit of this really quickly. Obviously, it's a big topic, but I want you to think about it in terms of the themes that we've been talking about and ask yourself, how did the things that happened in the 20th century follow from these Enlightenment modernist ideas? So the major one is who is the moral authority above the interests of the state? And on a secular nation state model, on the Enlightenment model, there is none. There is none. The problem is there are a bunch of different competing nation states. And so what happens? They continually go to war with each other. They're carving up the world. They're all trying to do world domination. The secular nation state is expanding out. It's trying to take over the whole world. It's trying to claim a new vision for reality. Who is going to be the Lord and possessor of nature? Which, of course, leads to the wars of the 20th century. Not just World War I and II, but all the different wars after World War I, the Cold War, the threat of nuclear crisis, and then the wars leading up to it, various revolutions, especially the Soviet Revolution in Russia, the revolution in China, the Communist Revolution, all this war and bloodshed and violence. And what's happening during this period is that technology is rapidly increasing, like almost exponentially. Like the growth of technology during this period has been remarked on by many scholars, because at the beginning of World War I, you literally had guys on horseback with sabers riding around at the beginning of World War I. But by the end of World War II, you have tanks and nuclear bombs and all, like the gap between warfare technology at the beginning of World War I and the end of World War II is a massive leap forward. What happened? Well, science was essentially mobilized to produce more and more deadly and efficient ways of killing people. So this was a huge blow to people's imagination, to the Enlightenment dream specifically, because the promise of the Enlightenment was utopianism. We're going to use science and technology to make more peace, more prosperity. Now we're done with the Dark Ages and the stupid oppressive church. Now everyone's going to be free. And actually what we see technology used for is the exact polar opposite. Death camps, eugenics programs. If you want to talk about the Holocaust or the Gulag, or pick your favorite example, all the forced famines, all of these are what? They're forms of the nation states competing with each other to see who's going to be the Lord and possessor of nature. And obviously we have to destroy everybody else. So it led to this concept called total war, which is the idea that when one people group, one nation goes to war against somebody else, it's a total war, meaning civilians are fine to be murdered. And we do that in the 20th century. So you're like, well, what else would you do? Well, in the ancient world, in the medieval world, there was this idea of just war. You could only go, Christian thinkers came up with this idea that there's so many conditions for a war to be just. And, one of them, I think, was that it had to be defensive in some nature. You can't just go murdering people. So there are all these checks and balances on it. And people didn't go to war lightly. And forever, it's been this code that you don't murder civilians. They're non-combatants. And then that all goes away with the idea of total war. So America nukes Japan. They kill all these civilians. What? You really have to reflect on that. And what's weird about it is that you say, oh yeah, we nuked Japan. You talk to Americans, they'll hand wave it. They're like, well, we saved more lives than if we had let the war continue. In other words, there's all these justifications for it. And whether or not that's true is, again, not really my point. My point is that we have this ease of conscience about things that are insane in their scope of the horrors that they've created. And there are no checks and balances on it. The only check and balance is other nation states murdering you. So the fact that we didn't nuke each other, like we nuked Japan, okay, but then everybody else developed nuclear technology, and now we kind of can't because nobody wants to start a nuclear war because then we all die. So you're telling me that's the check and balance on the nation state, is everyone's pointing nukes at each other and that this is morally superior to the Middle Ages? Really? Okay, so what happens? What happens? So after the World Wars, I'll say a little tiny bit about postmodernism. Postmodernism is a movement. It's expressed and therefore known most prominently through art culture, where there's all these deconstructive forms of paintings and stories and all this stuff. But really the philosophical heart of postmodernism, I would say, is a disillusionment with the Enlightenment dream of progress. So you could put it this way. The Enlightenment said, we are going to discard all this religious stuff. We can't trust it. It's been abused. No good. Okay, so now we're going to use pure reason and science and technology and math, and that's what we're going to put our faith in. And then, of course, you know, the 20th century just ruined any semblance that a nation state freed from the shackles of religious oppression was going to behave in any way better at all. It arguably behaved much, much worse. And so people who had only the Enlightenment dream to go on became disillusioned with that too. They were like, okay, well, that was a lie, I guess. I guess there was no superior moral order to come from just reason and science. And so then you have all these people who are disillusioned with reason and science too. And there's been a lot of talk in the last few years about, oh, postmodernism is this, it's, you know, it's anti-rational and it's illogical and all this kind of stuff. All true, of course. Many people have pointed this out. Excuse me. But I want to frame why that happened within the context of this narrative. The Enlightenment dream died and a bunch of people got disillusioned to it. So not only did they not have religion anymore, that was invalidated by the Enlightenment, but now they don't have reason anymore because that was so triumphantly kind of put forward as the standard for the new era. And the new era turned out to be worse than the previous eras. So naturally people got disillusioned with it, but they don't have anything left. So you don't have reason, you don't have religion. What do? Nothing. I mean, and that's why so many people are depressed. And that's why there's all this widespread nihilism and all these nihilist thinkers. We could talk about Nietzsche. He precedes this and predicts it. That's a very interesting topic. So just a few little things to point out here. Besides all this, our radical individualism, because again, you're the only one who can decide what's right for you. That turns into, so total freedom means everyone's individualized, which leads to a complete loss of shared culture, obviously. Fragmentation of families, fragmentation of individuals. There's no local culture, there's no macro culture other than the cult of the state, kind of. You know, if our culture is we all watch the same Netflix shows, is that really a culture? No, it's not. I mean, sort of, it's a pop culture, but it's not, it doesn't provide the infrastructure that a fully functional human culture provides. And then utilitarianism didn't really pan out either. Obviously for the things that some of you were pointing out in chat, but also because if you just focus on pain and pleasure, you're focusing on hedonism, right? This is what we talk about. This is what hedonism means, for those of you who don't know. It means the belief in that idea that pleasure is the highest thing and that the way you need to live your life is to pursue as much pleasure and minimize as much pain, which really is just an individualized form of utilitarianism. So this leads to consumerism, massive over-consumerism that you are all very familiar with, which weirdly has led to the complete loss of meaning, shared meaning in our culture, and a complete mental health crisis. I think a lot of these experts are calling it, we're in a mental health epidemic of depression, anxiety, suicide, violence, all this stuff. So the point is, the Enlightenment dream did not really get there. And now here we are. But it's important for you to realize why we're here. It's because of a progressive disillusionment from, I'm going to do a quick recap here. So for the whole show, the last 4 episodes. So it's scholasticism moves us towards purely rationalist thinking, sets the stage for mechanism, and the loss of immanence helps us to push God somewhere else. He's far away. He's not really paying attention. He's on the other side of purgatory. We just have the here and now. Then the Reformation individualizes and relativizes faith, and then religion becomes a matter of personal opinion, secularizes the state and the culture. And then the Enlightenment tries to rebuild Christian values using reason and math and science and all this stuff. It's very triumphalistic about that, but it can never quite get there because immediately the Romantic movement pushes back, because obviously you can't have a worldview in which all of these important critical elements of the human experience are rejected. And then with the progression in technology into the 19th and 20th centuries comes nothing but eugenics, wars, brutalities, and horrors. And so very quickly, the Enlightenment dream breaks down. And now, 21st century, everybody's on the internet, what are we doing? We're looking for meaning. We're looking for recreating culture through subcultural movements. There's these type of people on the internet. There's these type of people on the internet. It's all kinds of, there's people making up new movements all the time because we're looking for meaning. We're looking to rebuild culture. And we're trying to do it at a grassroots level because that's what the internet allows you to do. It allows you to make communities wherever you want. But there's no center. Why are we doing that if there's any other alternative? And there is no other alternative other than this like kind of weird cult of the state. But in the United States, that's kind of like, yeah, but it's whatever you want, man. It's just utilitarian hedonism. So I want to go to break. And I'll take a look at the chat while I'm at break. And then when we come back, we were going to talk about the secular nation state and a couple other topics. I'll see you there. How do you explain the sacraments? It's easy to say they're mysteries that we have to take on faith or on the authority of tradition, but that is not how the early Christians understood them. To them, and to all ancient people, the idea that physical objects had spiritual power was very intuitive, whereas modern people tend to find this difficult, bizarre, or even unchristian. This is because we live in an era shaped by secularism, a way of viewing the world that's incompatible with sacramental thinking. Because secular ideas are at the heart of our culture, modern people tend to think in secular ways without realizing it, even the most well-meaning of us. How then do we live in, but not be of, a secular culture? We need to understand the enchanted, sacramental way that the early Christians viewed the world, but we also need to understand secularism. What is it really? Where did it come from? And how does it influence how we think about religion? Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age breaks down these important issues in accessible, non-academic language and is an ideal introduction for young readers, catechumens, and seekers, as well as for any Orthodox Christians who want to deepen their understanding of the sacraments.
Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age by Zachary Porcu. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
Welcome back. There's a couple interesting things going on in chat. So one is this comment from Naval Orange Gazer, hilarious name, by the way. He says, it goes back further to the American Civil War that was technologically miles above the previous conflicts. It's the first post-industrial war. Yes, I wanted to talk more about industrialism, and we can't really, but we don't have time. But obviously you get a sense of it now, which is, well, industrialism, a whole cultural movement towards harnessing the whole power of technology and industry and the entire civilization to do what? To dominate the world. Yeah, of course. And then the American Civil War is this complete precursor to the technological advancements of the 20th century. That's a really good point. I'd love to talk more about that too sometime. But you're getting it, right? You're seeing the progression in the narrative that we're unfolding here from the Enlightenment. Let's see what else we got. So there's this really long question story in the live chat that started before the show started. I don't know if any of you saw that. It's really interesting. I'd love to get into it more, but the long and short of it is that, there's this guy, let's see. Well, there's about 6-8 of them, so I can't really summarize it. But basically, somebody was telling his story about being a convert to Orthodoxy and were previously part of this kind of anarcho-capitalist movement. Sounds kind of libertarian to me. And I think this is a really interesting story because it gives you a little anecdote about what our impulse is as modern people, which is to try to do reform. We're still reformers. We're always reformers, from the reformer popes to the Protestant reformers to now. Every new political movement is this attempt at reformation because we're trying to fix the world. That's a very uniquely kind of Western impulse. And we're going to invent or create rallying points around all these new visions of society. And they're sort of inherently utopian. And the reason, and the part I like about this comment, let me see if I can find it. The one that starts with wrong in some way. And he says, the church is the pillar and ground of truth, but I've been focusing on my own repentance and putting the problems of the world aside. And I think that's healthy. A lot of people will say, well, you're just ignoring the problem, blah, blah. But what's the problem? Is the problem that we're really trying to create heaven on earth? If we don't work hard, the utopia won't come. If you don't vote right, the utopia won't come. If you buy these products, the utopia won't come. If you don't recycle, the utopia won't come. None of that is important to the age to come. Well, I don't want to overgeneralize too much, but like the fixation on making heaven on earth leads you away from the age to come. What you do now to become fully human, to become saved, these things matter. But things only matter insofar as that is what we're doing, because heaven and earth are passing away. And so you see how this is not merely this movement towards utopianism is not merely just a secular impulse. It's a Western Christian impulse too, that is sort of based in this loss of immanence, where we have to build heaven on earth. So I think it's very healthy what you're saying. Thank you for sharing those stories. Really interesting. I love hearing stories like this. And yeah, don't stress out about making heaven on earth, because you're going to die and then everyone's going to die. And that's not, so ultimate meaning, we're not here to make heaven on earth. I'm checking more chat. Somebody's asking me, have you read That Hideous Strength? Better than 1984. All the weird modern philosophies such as Gates' Reset and more are present, a reminder that the build up to these times has been long. That Hideous Strength might be my favorite book. So yes, I have read it. It's so good. It's a weird novel if you're not ready for it. It's part of C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, which I think is brilliant. I actually did a talk on this at Doxicon a few years back, in which I argue that that space trilogy is probably the best piece of science fiction ever written. You can find a link to that on my website, actually. I thought it was a cool talk. We had a lot of fun talking about it. Let's see. Harry says, there are some seekers, but it still feels like the vast majority of the U.S. at least does not question whether engaging in a consumerist hedonist lifestyle is what they should be doing at all. Yeah, because that's our culture. Because meaning is to be found inside of you and is connected to what you like. Like this is our world. Let's see here. I'd be interested in an analysis of how ideas like pre-tribulation rapture flow out of these utopian ideals. That's really interesting. I've never thought about that. So there's a kind of certain kinds of Protestants, usually low, what we would call low church Protestants. At least I've experienced it a lot in evangelical and non-denominational circles. Is this really big emphasis on pre-tribulation and rapture stuff, and it sort of is a fixation on the heaven on earth part. So it's a heaven on earth reading of Revelation, which I think is probably part of all of this. You know, it's sort of inevitable. Rosie the Riveter, we can do it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is utopian. Rosie the Riveter is utopian too. We're going to talk about feminism. I'm very excited for that. Before we jump into the secular nation state, which is the last topic, I want to just say a couple things. So Journey to Reality, or that's the book. What is this? The podcast? Roots of Everything. The Roots of Everything, our format, if you didn't know, I said this at the beginning, is it's 4 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So we do 4-week series on something, on a particular topic. This time, obviously, it was 4 weeks on secularism. And then we're going to take 2 weeks off. So this is the last show today. And then there will be 2 weeks off. And then we'll start a new show. And every 4 weeks block is a series devoted to a particular topic. So we're going to do different topics as we go through. And I've already picked the next topic. It's going to be on the secular nation state in detail. So we're going to talk about, okay, how does the liberal democracy follow from the Enlightenment? What about fascism and Marxism? How do they fit into all of this? What does that look like in the 20th century? And we're going to talk about all those things in the context of everything we talked about in this series. And so I'm looking forward to that. But the series after that is not set in stone. And what I want to do for this show, because it's a listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio, I want you guys to vote on it. So if you go to my Substack, yes, I have a Substack, you can just subscribe to the free tier. And on the free tier, there are going to be posts every few weeks when we go to do the next series, in which I outline the topics and you guys can vote and comment. And I take all of that and I'll decide the next topic based on how you vote. So I want to do the things that you want to do. I keep saying I want to do everything. A lot of you say, yes, I also want to do everything, but what and in what order? So please go there, subscribe to the free tier and post on that stuff as it comes along. We'll talk more about this later at the end of the show. Okay, so the secular nation state, what is happening? So we're going to do this briefly because the next series is going to be completely devoted to this topic in great detail. But I wanted to emphasize to you again, and maybe you got this already, that the secular nation state is a new type of society. This is not a society that has ever existed before. Excuse me. And the myth about the secular nation state is that once we emancipate the state from the corrupt and oppressive influence of religion, then the state will be free to be more rational, to be more free. Individuals will have more freedom. People will get to do what they want. It's going to be a better society. We don't need religion. But of course, the reality is that it's a bad situation when you set up a power in society with no standards and no accountability than anything that's higher than its own self-interest. This is a total disaster. So I'm going to give a few quotes here from David Bentley Hart. And again, if you missed last week, you can go back and hear my disclaimer. I'm not signing off on whatever his various universalist beliefs are, but I think he is a great scholar and his early work is wonderful. And he hits a lot of the nails on the head here. So he's going to characterize, I want to give you these two quotes, because he characterizes the project that modernity and the secularism movement from the Enlightenment and the secular nation state is engaged with. The project is to create a society that's free from religion. And obviously this leads to a totally new socio-political order. So here is the first quote. He says, "Early modernity was the age of the great political struggle of the independent nation state to emancipate itself from all the religious, legal, moral, and sacramental bonds that had ever in any way confined or constrained its total sovereignty over its subjects. Older medieval models of overlapping and subsidiary spheres of authority and fealty, and of a realm of spiritual authority transcendent of the rule of princes, gave way to the idea of a monarch in whom the full power and legitimacy of the state in its every institution was perfectly consecrated. The monarch was now a tautology. A king was a king because he was a king, not because he was liege of his nation's estates, charged with reciprocal responsibility to his vassals, and subject to the church's laws." So DBH quotes are long. He's very verbose. I enjoy that. But the point here is that he's saying that the idea of monarchy in the pre-modern world was that a king had all these obligations to his lords, to society. He was subject to the church's moral laws. There were checks and balances on all of these things. We talked about this a few episodes back. But with early modernity, the church, as we saw, the state, as we saw, kept trying to sever ties with the church so that it didn't have to be morally accountable to these things. And it's this that created the idea of the absolute monarch. So when you think of monarchy, because you're raised in a liberal democracy, you probably think like, oh no, a king with absolute power sitting on his haunches, being rich and taxing the poor and no one can stop him. It's like, that's an absolute monarchy you're describing, but monarchies did not have to be absolute. They have all kinds of checks and balances on the medieval model. Obviously, there's all different kinds of this. But one of the most important things is that the monarchs are subject to the church's moral laws, just like the churches, the people who are in the church are citizens of the society and subjects of the king. So it goes both ways. This is how you have a totally integrated society. And Hart is explaining that this movement to separate church from state is really the movement of the state to be free of anything that can check its power. So here's the next quote. He says, "The church, the only universally recognized transnational authority that could possibly rival or even overrule the power of the monarch had to be reduced to a national establishment, an office of the state, or a mere social institution. This was the principal reason, after all, for the success of the Reformation, which flourished only when it served the interests of the secular state in its rebellion against the customs and laws of Christendom and its campaign against the autonomy of the church within its territory. So in other words, he's saying that the Reformation succeeded anywhere where it could help the secular state get rid of its obligation to the church. He calls the church the only universally recognized transnational authority that could possibly rival or even overrule the power of the monarch. Transnational, meaning there's a Catholic Church in the West. It doesn't matter if you're German or Italian or French, whatever. It's a transnational authority that can overrule the monarch. But now, again, Henry VIII, great example. If you create a new church and you make the head of that church the king, now you've eliminated probably the greatest rival to absolute power and authority, actually, ironically, which is the opposite of what we've all been taught to believe as modern people, you see. So, so I'm deciding how much of this I want to get into, how much we're going to save for the next series on the secular nation state. So, let me say a little bit about separation of church and state, because people think like, if you don't have separation of church and state, you're going to have this horrible theocracy. But here's a different way of framing the question. Let's get away from this image of the church, which is this boogeyman that everyone has. What do we mean by the church? Well, we mean the institutionalization of religion in society. What do we mean by religion? We mean worldview. We mean a worldview with a clear and coherent vision of absolute moral values. In other words, religion, really, when you get right down to it, is the answer to the question, what is good? Not what do I like, not what do I prefer, not what's efficient, what is good, which is an absolute moral statement at a cosmic level about reality. Okay. So if religion, whatever your religion, is the answer to that question, and you say, we are going to run the state without reference to religion, what you're really saying is, we're going to run society without defining what the good is. It's a little bit like saying, well, it's exactly like saying, the question, how do we run society, is unrelated to the question of what is good. And when you put it that way, you realize that this is actually insane. This is actually an insane way to think about society, and no one ever thought about society before. That's what's going on with the secular nation state. This is what people don't appreciate about it, because we've got all these centuries of Enlightenment propaganda telling us that this is a bad thing. Now, is it a bad thing if the church takes over the state and is oppressive and horrible? Obviously. Is it a bad thing if the state uses religion as its excuse to slaughter each other? Of course. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how are you conceiving of society's relation to absolute standards of morality? But of course, if morality has been rationalized out of existence, essentially, you don't have any moral grounding for reality. All you have is the total, unchecked power of the secular nation state. So, I have a long quote for you, and this is the last one from David Bentley Hart, and I've broken it up into three slides here. So, excuse me. He's going to characterize the Enlightenment and then talk about its downfall. And I think now you're kind of set up to see what the force of what he means here. So he says, part of the enthralling promise of an age of reason was, at least at first, the prospect of a genuinely rational ethics, not bound to the local or tribal customs of this people or that, not limited to the moral precepts of any particular creed, but available to all reasoning minds, regardless of culture, and, when recognized, immediately compelling to the rational will. What does this mean? This is the Enlightenment dream, that we can make a genuinely rational ethics that's not limited to any particular person, any particular culture, any particular creed, because again, Europe had just gotten done murdering each other over ostensibly creedal differences, but we know that's not really the case. So when recognized, immediately compelling to the rational will. This was an Enlightenment idea, that morality was so rational that if you were rational enough yourself, you would be able to just know what the moral thing is to do. All rational thinking minds would find it obvious. This was something the Enlightenment thinkers said all the time. Well, it's obvious to all rational minds. Now, did that work out? So this is what Hart says in commentary on that. He says, was there ever a more desperate fantasy than this? We live now in the wake of the most monstrously violent century in human history, during which the secular order on both the political left and the political right, freed from the authority of religion, showed itself willing to kill on an unprecedented scale and with an ease of conscience worse than merely depraved. Again, endless justifications of what happened in World War II. I brought up the bombing, the nuking of Japan. There were so many horrors. You think only the Nazi scientists did eugenics? America was so part of the eugenics movement. There's so much going on with that. I can't even get into it right now. So we just do it. We do it on an unprecedented scale, and we have this ease of conscience about it. That's pretty crazy. So in commenting on that, he concludes this passage by saying the following: if ever an age deserved to be thought an age of darkness, it is surely ours. One might almost be tempted to conclude that secular government is the one form of government that has shown itself too violent, capricious, and unprincipled to be trusted. And I think there's a lot to this. I think we really need to dispense with, people are resistant to this conclusion, but I think it's because we have Enlightenment ideas. We have this mythology about the boogeyman of the church, and then we just kind of hand wave these massive atrocities that the secular nation state commits. Now, let me address a quick counter objection to this, because every time I bring this up, somebody goes, well, it's just because we had more technology than the ancients. They would have killed at just as much a scale if they could have. Or they'll say, well, and let me address that first. So I don't think that's obvious at all, because again, ancient people did not develop technology in accordance to this idea that there was some kind of myth of progress. So again, I always love giving this example. It looks like the ancient Greeks came up with the steam engine, but nobody used it. Aristotle and the boys were not like, oh, sweet, we're going to get rich making steam powered everything. We're going to change society. We're going to move it closer to utopia. No, nobody cared, because they had a slave society. They were leisure class scientists and thinkers. They were brilliant. They were smarter than any of you or me or anybody today. The ancients were so smart. And they didn't care because they had a different imaginative framework for reality, which was not this weird myth of progress utopianism thing. So they could have come up with all kinds of tech. They had it available, that they had no interest in doing so because they weren't animated by the same mythology that we were. We, animated by this mythology, continued to make all this technological cultural progression. That's our tech progress is not inevitable. Our tech progress was the result of an ideology that said we could be the lords and dominion and masters of nature if we just did the right algorithm and conducted the right engineering experiment. Okay, so here's the other thing people usually say to this. They say, well, okay, sure, there were atrocities in modernity, but look, there were atrocities in the Middle Ages, there were atrocities in the ancient world, there was still all this corruption and violence and bloodshed and murder and all this kind of stuff. Sure, granted. That's not the question, though, because people who make this objection tend to want, in my experience, they tend to want to say, well, the medieval world didn't produce utopia, therefore it wasn't valid. It didn't work, just like modernity doesn't work. But I'm going to argue that that's utopian thinking, because it's the thinking that the right society, the right way to run society, will necessarily equal the perfect society. It's the same kind of person who looks at Orthodox Christianity and says, well, everybody isn't a saint in the Orthodox Church. There's scandal and dramas, and sometimes there's, bishops get deposed and there's corruption. Therefore, it must not be the true church. And it's like, you see the confusion. That's not the question. There's always this, and ancient and medieval people accepted that there was always going to be violence. There's always going to be corruption. There's always going to be problems, because welcome to earth. We have sin here. Would you like a Pepsi to console you? It's not, it cannot be heaven. You cannot make heaven on earth. So the real question is, how then are you going to aim yourself, right? Because it's Lent. You're all trying to fast and go to church and not sin, and you're sinning anyway. Me too. I just got back from confession. So what do we say about that? Well, it doesn't work. It's fake. You're still sinning. No, that's utopian. That's a mechanistic way of thinking about morality. If you just do the formula, you'll be fine. We know that that's not how that works. We know that that's not how that works. We know that we're struggling toward the kingdom of heaven. So it's better to be oriented, fall, get up, go to confession. We know that about the spiritual life. It's the same with society. The question of what society produced the best outcome, that's utilitarianism. The question should be, what is the right way to aim society? And what I'm proposing is that it's complete madness to say that we're going to order society in such a way that we refuse to answer the question, what is good? And in fact, we're going to bracket that off from the entire way that we run civilization. And we're going to have no checks on the secular nation state. Religion, in other words, the answer to the question of the good, will not be involved in the discussion of how we run society. That's crazy, actually. And naturally, it leads to a world where we use science and technology to produce horrors. Somebody brought up That Hideous Strength. That's such a good book to make all these points. I really highly recommend. It is weird. I recommend you read the first 2 books first. One on-ramp for you is that Lewis says that That Hideous Strength is sort of the novel version of the points that he was making in his essay, Abolition of Man. So, yeah, I mean, there's so much more we could say about this. I'm going to save it to talk more about when we really get into what the secular nation state is in detail in the next series after 2 weeks. So let me take a quick look at chat here. Is that Puritan-like impulse just another form of utopianism? If your church contains sinful leaders, it's clearly no better than any other. I'm not sure what the Puritan-like impulse is. I mean, I think it's got to be, Puritanism is so crazy. It's deeply anti-sacramental, actually. When the Puritans took over England, they outlawed Christmas and Easter, I believe. It's something like that. Totally crazy. But, all of these Protestant movements that attempt to make the right church, this time we're going to do it right, it's part of the reformational impulse of the Reformation. I think it's part of the secularization. Because the secularization, if we separate God from man, and we're just kind of alone here, then we got to make heaven on earth. I mean, it's utopian. And you could argue, I think Father Strickland more or less argues that impulse starts with Catholicism itself in the High Middle Ages with the Reformer popes. And, did it start for a good reason? Was it justified? Was there corruption in the Western bishops? Yes. But, here we are. Again, I'm not really here to place blame. I'm really here more to connect the dots for you so you have some sort of context for why we got here, for what's going on. Okay, so we are at the end of the series on secularism, the 4-part series. I told you, we're taking 4 weeks. We do 4 weeks on, we take 2 weeks off. So the next 2 weeks, there's going to be no live show on AFR. However, and this is nice because it lines up with Holy Week and Bright Week. However, there are going to be more episodes of The Roots of Everything on my Substack. So we're going to do 2 weeks, the 2 weeks that we have off. It's sort of off. There's going to be 2 episodes, 1 per week on my Substack if you go to that. So next week, there will be no live show on the YouTube channel. But if you're one of the subscribers, you can listen to the sort of bonus 5th episode next Monday, same time, 1 p.m. And in that, I'm going to specifically get into how our Enlightenment ideals of radical individualism, stuff like that, leads to the radical liberalism of the 20th and 21st centuries. And we're going to talk a little bit about what liberalism means, because people throw this word all around. It has many, many meanings. And we're going to do that. And then the next week of the second week off, we're going to do a pop culture episode. And I want to do this for every series. So next time in 2 weeks, the bonus episode will be some kind of pop culture connections. So on that one, we're going to talk about the difference between Star Trek and Warhammer, because Star Trek, especially the next generation, has this extremely Enlightenment morality. I think it's really interesting. And we're going to talk about the Lord of the Rings and compare the books and the movies, because I think you will see a secular change between the books and the movies. One's enchanted, one's actually very secular. We'll talk a little bit more about why. So that's in 2 weeks. So if you want to get this stuff, there's also going to be all kinds of other content on my Substack. We're going to do a monthly AMA. There's going to be weekly posts also, all this bonus content. So you see this on the page right now. I'm doing a special for a subscription. So I'm doing 50% off all the paid subscriptions. If you're interested in this content, it's like a launch special. So just go to zacharyporcu.substack.com/launch special. One word, launch special. And you'll get, it's like 58% off or something like that. I'm really excited about it. I want to see you there. It's like $3 a month if you do that. And again, bonus episodes of Roots of Everything, weekly reflection posts and videos, AMA every month. We're going to have a great time. I want to continue these conversations, and I want you guys there interacting with it, because I'm loving all the comments, and I'm loving all the interaction. So last week, 2 weeks off the live channel, but 1 p.m. next Monday and the next Monday, we'll do stuff on the Substack. So I hope to see you there. And thank you for joining me on this listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. And I'll see you next time.